What happens when you get paper from China, a large educated population, and a common language that basically spans the entirety of Dar al-Islam? Well, you get a golden age. That's what you get. This is, without a doubt, the greatest literary period in the history of the Islamic world. This is where you get the story of 1001 Arabian Nights by Scheherazade. It's where you actually get a prolific female poet who, according to some historians, has probably written more than any other poet in the Muslim world until about the 20th century. Anyway, the reasons for this is one, the relative stability of the Abbasid Empire. You know, creative types need some basic level of safety. The other thing is you have the emergence of two major languages. You have an elite language, Persian, for the Abbasid court, partially because we can sort of talk about this. The Persian language was the language of many senior priests and intellectuals during this time period. But Arabic became the language of religion, law, and the natural sciences, and the reason for this is that the Quran could only be read in Arabic. So, if you were going to read the Quran, then you had to learn Arabic. This perfect storm of creativity was also aided by the introduction of paper coming in from China. Of course, the process of making paper it basically travels along the Silk Road into the Abbasid Caliphate. So what you get is not only do you have lots of creative people, they're able to produce and reproduce works fairly on a fairly cheap basis, because most other forms of making books and making really any written product is incredibly expensive. Basically, a book, especially before the printing press, was less a $20 Amazon purchase and more of a house payment. Incredibly expensive. So, and of course, because books had to be, made by hand, again, before the printing press and the movable type, they were also incredibly long to create. Persian was a significant influence in this literary golden age. So, for example, you have this epic text, the Shah-Namah, which is a history of Persian kings from creation to the Islamic conquest. You also kind of see this nostalgia for, the old Persian Empire as it was. You also have 1001 Arabian Nights by Scheherazade. Scheherazade, by the way, is a very Persian name. So it follows the story of Scheherazade, and in a meta way, it's a story about stories. Basically, you have this king, King Shahryar, who is sort of a bit like a Henry VIII kind of character. In other words, he likes to chop off the heads of his wives, lovers, that kind of thing. Well, he, Scheherazade has to, I think, spend the night with him. And Scheherazade is perceptive enough to know that she's probably going to be executed unless something happens. So what she decides to do is she decides to entertain the king with a number of different stories. And what she does is she leaves off each night on a cliffhanger so that the king always wants her to come back and tell him more. And hence, they do this until apparently she runs out of stories. And some of those stories include, for example, the story of Sinbad and I think Aladdin. There's just tons of stories that come out of the 1001 Arabian Nights compilation. But by the end of the book, apparently the king has fallen in love with her. Aww. Even though 1001 Arabian Nights depicts Scheherazade occupying a fairly traditional female role, Scheherazade is a character who uses her wits, her charm, her charisma, and her creativity to save her own life. She has some level of agency in a situation where there's actually not that much agency. And similarly, not only do we have fictional female storytellers, we have real female storytellers. We have Aisha Baunia. My pronunciation is suspect. And Aisha was a poet who wrote mostly religious poetry, but religious poetry from the Sufi tradition that we'll talk a little bit more about. But apparently, she was able to study with male counterparts basically as an equal. And according to many scholars, she wrote more poetry, more written works than any other woman in Islamic history up until the 20th century. Okay, let's talk about art and architecture in the Abbasid Caliphate specifically, but also just Dar al-Islam in general. So if you look right here, you notice that there's a lot going on. This is basically the underside of a dome in a rather large mosque. I'm not really sure which mosque this is, but just like European cathedrals, mosques, religious shrines in general, became places of intense artistic creativity. Now, the thing with Islam in general is that many Muslims, especially Sunni Muslims, interpret the hadiths of the Quran to basically prohibit the portrayal of living beings. The idea is that living beings are creations of God, and by trying to artistically render a living being, one is sort of like playing the role of Allah. So, in general, Muslim art, Sunni Muslim art, is what we would call aniconic. So, in other words, you have, that doesn't mean that there isn't art or artistic creativity, obviously. It just means that it gets funneled into things like geometric patterns. And of course, you have these incredibly ornate and ostentatious buildings, shrines, palaces, so on. There was a ton of creativity as well in the evolution of Islam itself. But creativity is sometimes not without controversy, and that's especially the case in religion. So, some vocabulary terms first. So, you have what we call the ulama, which are the community of religious scholars across the Muslim world. So, during this time period, they became a lot more suspicious and conservative. Remember, we don't mean that they're Reagan voters, they just mean that they become more tradition bound. One thing that makes people suspicious and conservative is, of course, instability, like war, like, for example, the Crusades. So the general embrace of Greco-Roman culture that we've talked about, that you saw in Dar al-Islam, that gets rolled back because suddenly the Crusaders become associated with this fancy Greek learning, which is kind of ironic because, if anything, the Muslim world embraced Greco-Roman learning far more than the Europeans did. It's not really until the Renaissance that happens. So this is the environment that produces the Sufis. Remember, Islam, like Christianity, is a very social and community-based religion. It doesn't really have, or at least there's not much in the Quran that talks about sort of a mystical tradition. Like, for example, you have with Buddhism, which Buddhism is almost all mystical, almost all individualistic, whereas Islam and Christianity really aren't. So what happens is you see the emergence of the Sufi branch of Islam during the Abbasid Caliphate. Now, the Sufis are very interested in mysticism, meditation, living an ascetic lifestyle, and of course, sort of triggering religious trances and bouts of euphoria through songs and dances and drugs. Sometimes just drinking a lot of coffee, actually. And the idea is connecting with Allah in that way. Now, the Sufis sort of have a mixed reputation throughout Dar al-Islam, but what we can say is that in terms of their effectiveness at spreading the faith, they're incredibly successful. They're responsible for spreading Islam deep into parts of Asia and Africa. And it has to be said that some of the traditions of Sufi Islam is more similar to the animistic religions that you might find in sub-Saharan Africa, in parts of Asia. Because of their mystical reputation, they sort of gain the reputation of being healers and miracle workers. I can't really speak to how successful they were as healers and miracle workers. The economy of the Abbasid Caliphate, like the economy of Dar al-Islam in general, and most of the rest of the world, was based on agriculture and trade. But the thing is that if you had to select the trade equivalent of boardwalk in Monopoly, it would probably be the Middle East. And we'll talk about that in just a second. So there are a number of factors that make the Islamic world just so overpowered for trade. One of those factors, interestingly, is that there aren't very many resources. For developing your economy, having a complex economy, believe it or not, you don't want lots of resources. Because if you have lots of resources, then, well, you're probably not going to be very interested in going out and looking for more. It's the Chinese problem, right? Remember that in the case of China, their trade is kind of an afterthought because the Chinese economy is pretty self-sufficient. They have most of what they need. Well, in the Middle East, you don't. It's fairly resource poor, so Arabic traders had to go out and basically acquire the goods they did want through trade. So a lot of that trade occurs along the Indian Ocean through these ships with triangular sails called dhows, D-H-O-W-S. And I just want to kind of give you an idea of how far these trade routes go. So you have Arabic traders that are trading as far as the Netherlands, the Low Countries at the time. You have overland trade with China, and of course you also have a series of routes, caravan routes, that basically take Arabic traders down into sub-Saharan Africa through to the, for example, the Malian Empire or the Songhai Empire, depending on the time period you're looking at. Religious diversity actually becomes an economic plus because obviously this is a time period where in the great monotheistic religions there is a period of the week where everything sort of shuts down because it's a holy day. Well, the thing is that you have different holy days for different religions. So the Muslim holy day is Friday, so everything shuts down then. But if, for example, you still want to go and buy stuff, you can find Christian or Jewish merchants. Of course, for Jews, their holy day is Saturday. For Christians, it's Sunday. So in other words, the economy is still going, even though you have societies that practice strict religious observance of the Sabbath. So what did the economy look like? In terms of agricultural produce, you have the trade of sugarcane, rice, spinach, and artichokes. And you also have, we've kind of seen this from the art and architecture, you have artisans that create glassware, pottery, jewelry, furniture, carpets, products that require a fair bit of skill to manufacture. So the Middle East is, as the name implies, smack dab in the middle. Basically, all trade in this hemisphere has to go through the Middle East. Even Indian Ocean trade has to basically stop off on the Sinai Peninsula, right? So all of it has to flow through the Middle East. So this means that the Islamic world had a huge advantage over their European, African, and East Asian counterparts. Muslims had access to basically all major trade routes. So the Mediterranean, which is right here, the Trans-Saharan, which is right here, the Silk Road, right here, and finally, Indian Ocean trade. This is another reason why you can kind of see the high social status of merchants in the Muslim world. Again, this is where I say for practically the billionth time, Muhammad himself was a Muslim, but probably the high social status of merchants was something that pre-existed Islam. So, speaking of traveling, here is a name that I want you to remember, Ibn Battuta. So you see him in a lot of primary sources. I think maybe in your first DBQ, you have a source from him, so you're going to see him quite a bit. He is a Moroccan Muslim legal scholar and world traveler. And I mean, with trade routes like this, you could actually travel the world as a practical matter. And so it sort of makes sense that someone from the Muslim world would be probably one of the greatest and earliest world travelers in history. So his travels originally began because of religion. Remember that in the Muslim world, you have what is called one of the pillars of Islam is the Hajj, basically the pilgrimage to Mecca. So even non-travelers, even people like me who probably stay at home way too much, they're encouraged to get out of their house and go take a pilgrimage to Mecca as in order to fulfill one of their sacred duties in Islam. So he leaves originally to take the Hajj, but of course that later turns into a pretty epic 24-year-long road trip. And he pretty much goes everywhere. He goes and visits the Songhai along the coast of Africa. He visits the Swahili coast of Africa. He basically goes to all the major empires, including in the Middle East, in India. He visits the Delhi Sultanate. He goes to China. And he even goes and meets the Byzantine/Eastern Roman emperor. So Ibn Battuta dictated his experiences to a scribe shortly before his death in 1369. But once they were compiled, they spread fairly widely around the Islamic world. And it's one of the reasons that the Islamic world had, up until the age of European exploration, the best maps on Earth, partially because of Ibn Battuta's voyages or journeys. Now, of course, he's not the only traveler, but he's sort of like the most extreme example. Now, that being said, while his information was very helpful, not all of it was accurate. Some people doubt that he actually ever made it to China because some of his accounts of China are just flat wrong. And some people believe that he just made it up. What is also the case is even when he's being accurate, he sort of reflects the biases, prejudices, and dominant opinions of his timeline. Like, for example, when he visits the Songhai in sub-Saharan Africa, let's just say that romantic relationships were much more open, and there was a generally more liberal attitude to sexuality. And of course, Ibn Battuta sort of freaks out and is incredibly judgmental. And part of this is because he thinks that all Muslims, of course, share the same moral values and principles and that kind of thing. What he finds out, though, is that actually there's a lot of diversity even within Islam over how things should be interpreted. So that is the world of Dar al-Islam. Now, next time, we continue our journey east and we check in on the Indian subcontinent. Till then.